David, William, Pierce, welcome back. And last week we arrived at the heart of reality and perhaps the most expansive claim in the entire Tantric map. Nothing exists outside of the couple. Every person, every experience, every contraction and expansion, it's all an expression of one underlying consciousness, one brain. Which raises a fairly obvious question. If it's true, why don't we feel like that? Why, if our deepest nature is already whole, do so many of us walk around feeling like we're not enough, inadequate, powerless, unworthy? Why do we look towards things like relationships, money, success, power, recognition, or spiritual experiences, thinking that once we finally have enough of them, then we'll feel complete? This week, Tantra gives an answer. It's called Anavamala, the impurity of individuality. And despite the rather ominous name, an impurity isn't something dirty or sinful about you. It's a limitation in the way reality is being perceived by you. The tradition identifies three of these malas: Anavamala, the impurity of individuality; Maya mala, the impurity of differentiation; and Karma mala, the impurity of action. And together they constitute our experience of bondage, of suffering, of limitedness. So imagine putting on a pair of glasses. The glasses don't change reality itself, they change what you're capable of seeing. And that's roughly how I understand the malas. From the non-dual perspective, they aren't actually stains upon consciousness, as a lot of thought constructs are considered to be. They're forms of limited perception that consciousness takes on in order to experience itself as a finite individual. And this distinction matters. Tantra isn't saying there's something spiritually wrong with you because you experience limitation. It's limitation that makes individuality possible. It's a necessary axiom of existence. If you experience yourself continuously as infinite consciousness without contraction whatsoever, there wouldn't be much of a you, or me, or them, or anyone having a particular human experience, like your partner, for example, or that family member or loved one you're being challenged by or excited with. The contraction gives us the individual. It's what brings us into existence. The problem begins when we forget it's a contraction and mistake our limited perspective for the whole truth of who we are. And beneath that mistake lies the first and most fundamental impurity, Anavamala. This belief that there's something wrong with you, that you're incomplete or not enough in some way. Anavamala is described as fundamental because the other two impurities depend upon it. Blow this one out and you're golden, the rest are gone. And its heart, it's an extraordinarily simple perception. The idea that something is missing, that something is wrong with you, that you're not enough, you're incomplete, that I'm powerless. I'm insignificant, I'm unworthy, I'm not enough, I'm incomplete, I'm powerless, I'm insignificant, I'm unworthy. Maybe one of those sounds familiar to you, a resounding echo in your mind. Maybe it's when you get the relationship, you'll feel complete, or when you make enough money, you'll feel safe. Or when the business succeeds, you'll feel empowered. Or when your body looks different, you'll feel healthy. Maybe it's a story that when someone finally chooses you, validates you, celebrates me, or tells me I'm enough, the objects differ, but the underlying movement is remarkably similar. Something outside of me needs to change before I can finally be okay inside me. Tantra Illuminated describes Anavamala as the deep belief that we're incomplete, imperfect, limited, and powerless, a perception that prevents us from knowing and revering our deepest nature. And perhaps you've noticed this paradox already yourself. Last week we spoke into how nothing is outside the heart. This week we're discovering the part of us that feels like we are, the belief beneath the beliefs. But here's where this becomes particularly interesting for the transformational work that we've been exploring. Anavamala isn't simply another negative thought. You might recognize a belief like, I'm not successful enough, I'm difficult to love, or I don't deserve to receive. Those are thoughts, and we can become conscious of. Anavamala sits deeper. The text describes it as pre-consciousness. It isn't merely something you think about yourself. It's a way of seeing reality that exists underneath your ordinary thought and perception. Think about wearing tinted glasses your entire life. If everything you've ever seen has had a slight blue tint, you probably don't walk around thinking everything looks blue because I'm wearing blue sunglasses. You just think, that's what the world looks like. That's the difference. If somewhere deep within me exists the perception I'm not enough, I don't necessarily wake up every morning consciously thinking those words. Instead, somebody criticizes me and I hear proof that I'm failing. My partner becomes distant and I interpret it as evidence that I'm undesired. Someone else succeeds and suddenly their achievement seems to say something about my inadequacy, an opportunity that appears, and I decide I'm not ready. A belief isn't merely another thought appearing within my experience, it's helping construct the experience that I'm having. So why does this cause suffering? Well, this is the Tantric idea of suffering. The teaching makes a very strong claim. Suffering arises when our perception of reality is out of alignment with the actual nature of reality. So if last week's teaching is correct, if the same consciousness expressing itself through everything is also expressing itself through you, then the deepest belief that you are fundamentally deficient, separate, or incomplete cannot be ultimately true. And yet we recognize our lives around it and organize our lives around it. Imagine being a millionaire who has forgotten the password to their bank account. The money hasn't disappeared, but their lived experience might be one of scarcity because they cannot access what's already theirs. Anavamala is kind of something like that. Tantra isn't saying become whole, it's saying you've forgotten the fullness that is already there. You are infinite consciousness experiencing limited being. And because we don't experience that fullness, we go looking for something capable of fulfilling and filling that apparent void, that hole. And this is why positive thinking is enough. It's another fascinating implication. If the problem is that I don't feel whole, perhaps the solution is simply to start saying I am whole. And in fact, that's what this week's mantra, Aham Purna, I am whole, is. But Tantra makes an important distinction here. Repeating the opposite belief is not enough. If somewhere deep within you believes that you're unlovable, standing in front of the mirror saying that you are, repeating the affirmation that I'm lovable, it may be useful, but the intellectual statement doesn't necessarily touch the deeper perception organizing your experience. It's not felt. Because Anavamala isn't merely an intellectual understanding, it goes deeper than that, it's more fundamental. So Tantra says it must ultimately be displaced by experience. You have to experience fullness. And what brings us to one of the words from this week's teaching is Purnata, fullness, completeness, divine perfection. I'd say it's my Sanskrit word for the week, Purnata. The teaching says you need to experience that fullness deeply within your own being, frequently and powerfully, enough that it gradually becomes your new reference point for who you are. You don't simply convince yourself that you're whole. You have to begin to know what wholeness feels like. Imagine somebody who has never felt safe in a relationship. You could explain secure attachment to them for hours, and they might understand every concept perfectly, but then imagine they experience a relationship in which they reveal something vulnerable and the other person stays. They're upset and the other person doesn't abandon them. They make a mistake and discover they're still loved. Something begins changing that no amount of intellectual explanation could create on its own. They aren't merely learning that maybe they're safe. They're having an experience of safety. And enough experiences like that can gradually change what their nervous system expects from relationship. That's how I understand the significance of purnata here. The spiritual path isn't simply replacing the sentence I'm incomplete with I'm complete. It's cultivating experiences of completeness enough until fullness becomes increasingly familiar. This week's integration pack goes into this. The shift occurs when fullness is experienced often or powerfully enough that I am incomplete. That thought is no longer the deepest place from which we understand ourselves, from which we act, from which desire arises. But now we reach the paradox that can be challenging but also beautiful, because Tantra doesn't simply tell us that we feeling something is missing is a problem we need to eliminate. Hidden inside that feeling is information. Maybe you've experienced this. You have the relationship, the money, or the job, or the recognition. You finally get the thing you were convinced would make everything okay, and perhaps it does feel wonderful, but eventually there's that feeling again. There must be something more. I'm not enough. Whatever it might be. Normally we interpret that as evidence that we need the next something, the relationship that's better, the more money, more success, another experience, another medicine ceremony. But Tantra offers a radically different interpretation. Perhaps the longing isn't proof that you're incomplete. Perhaps it's evidence that your current experience of yourself is incomplete. The teaching says that mala-driven feeling that something's missing contains a grain of truth. We're not accurately perceiving the whole of our nature. The spiritual path begins when we recognize that romance, money, power, fame, whatever it might be, none of it can ultimately fill that void and become open to a more fundamental transformation in our experience of reality. It changes the question completely then. Instead of what do I need to get so I can finally become whole, we can begin asking, what if this longing is inviting me to discover the wholeness I haven't yet learned to experience? From contraction to expansion. This is where the movement begins to reverse. The teaching says contraction begins turning toward expansion when we stop believing deep down that our limited experience of reality is all there is to know. And I love that, because you don't need to have figured everything out. You don't need to have permanently experienced yourself as divine or eliminated the feeling of incompleteness. Something much smaller can begin the movement. You become willing to question it. And maybe the voice saying, I'm not enough, isn't telling you the truth. Maybe that experience isn't all that there is. Maybe who you've experienced yourself as isn't all that you are. Maybe there's more to discover. And in that opening, contraction begins becoming expansion. So perhaps this week's teaching gives us a different way of understanding the parts of ourselves that continually speak more. The longing to love, success, recognition, money, achievement, or belonging isn't necessarily something we need to reject, but we can become curious about the deeper assumption beneath it. What am I expecting this to finally prove or provide about me? Anavamala says something is missing from me. Purnata invites us to discover through lived experience that nothing fundamental was missing in the first place. And perhaps that's why the ache itself can eventually become the doorway home, the moment we stop treating our limited experience of ourselves as the whole truth and another possibility opens. Instead of how do I finally become enough, what if it becomes, what would change if I began living from the possibility that I already am? And so that brings us to this week's integration question. Where in your life have you been living from the belief that something is missing or wrong with you? And if you stopped organizing your choices around that sense of lack, who would you choose to be now? And what would begin if you began allowing yourself to become? And when you notice yourself contracting back into that old story this week, perhaps you don't need to argue with it. Just ask, what would fullness choose here? Thank you for joining me this week, this round, this transmission, and I'll see you in the next transmission. Cheers.